Georgia, I know that this is your first like debut feature film. What was it like bringing that to life, and what was that process like?
Oh God, it was pretty terrifying. But it was made all the more enjoyable and enriching by the fact that the film had been inspired by a handful of real women and their experiences of working as lesbian PE teachers in the late 80s and early 90s. And so their input was really, really felt, not just in the research phase, but throughout the process of production. And they were able to speak to Rosie and the other cast members, and then they were with us when we screened the film. And so I think that's kind of one of the main things that I hold on to in terms of like taking a bird's eye view perspective of the whole experience of making the film, because it was tough. It was my first feature. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But there was this kind of through line from the very beginning in 2018 of speaking to those women and hearing their stories and wanting so passionately to tell those stories and trying to get money to be able to tell those stories. And then, where we're at today, which is speaking about the film and talking about the kind of political aspect of the film and all of that. But like for me, it's all wrapped up in those women and their experiences. And that's the main kind of focus for me.
I mean, it was fantastic. It truly felt like you stepped in a time machine and kind of pulled everything back from the 80s. And I wanted to ask both of you how that environment kind of affected the mood and kind of when you were, obviously, Rosie, you were in every scene, but how did the environment curate the tone that you were going for?
Um, I mean, obviously the music was amazing. I was very happy about that. But I actually think we've been asked before if you feel like things have changed, and ultimately a lot of the stuff that Jean experiences, particularly little microaggressions and conversations that she's having, are actually from experiences that have happened today. So I think if the setting was now, people wouldn't actually be that surprised. But I think the thing about it being the 80s, which I haven't really considered, is like there's no phone, there's no internet. It's very stripped bare, and it's a very isolated experience in the sense that it's just about moment to moment what she's feeling, what she's seeing. She's sort of only seeing very simplistic and suffocating heteronormative images, because that's all she ever had access to, because there was no internet or phones and social media. So I think stripping all that away just made it very isolated. And I don't know what else that does, but it just makes it this one thing, as opposed to like, oh, she's seeing that and experiencing that and texting that and hearing this. And I think that really helped.
And do you think that played into kind of her internalized homophobia? I mean, I think one of the lines that stood out most was when she was talking to Viv, and I don't wear my sexuality like a badge, and oh, because I do. And I feel like those conversations are still happening today. So how did you, I mean, it's a reoccurring theme of like how much of it is just internalized and how much is privacy and how much, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm just curious.
I think what's so heartbreaking is Jean just wants to live her life. She just wants to have a girlfriend and go to work, and she's been bombarded by mum and dad have baby. That's all she's ever seen. That's all she's ever known. So she has been programmed. She's a product of her society, that what she feels is abnormal, it's absurd, it's gross. So she has all this shame, and suddenly her life becomes defined by her sexuality. And she just wants to be herself. And I think that's the saddest thing ever. And it felt like there was only two ways. If you weren't going to be completely out and proud and political and wear your pride flag on your sleeve, then there was literally no space for you within the queer community. And I think that balance and that nuance is really interesting. And I imagine it definitely is something that still happens today. And I think one of the saddest things about Jean is that she just wants to be free and not defined by any social norms or social constructs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful story about liberation, or the therefore lack of in the beginning. But a huge part where I also love the film was this: it's so intimate, and I loved kind of almost like the reclaiming of the female body from the bedroom scenes to the kitchen to the locker room and the tea, and all of that was just so shot beautifully. And did you guys have any conversations between director and actor to kind of create those safe spaces for nudity? And yeah.
Yeah, we did. We also worked with an intimacy coordinator, which was really brilliant from my side, for knowing that any actor that was involved in any intimate scene of any kind during the whole process of making the film, that I would know going into that scene that they would have already had many conversations with the intimacy coordinator that I was not privy to. And so I think it's really important. It kind of triangulates the dynamic between actor and director, and I think that's important when you're thinking about intimate scenes, because there's things that you become very close as actor and director, but there's things that maybe you might not feel comfortable saying, and that there's a power dynamic at play there. And I think having somebody else there who is impartial and separate, and those conversations happening for me behind closed doors, I think that is a really important part of the process. And we were also we had a very female heavy team, but we did have men on our camera team and our assistant director team. And I remember having conversations with everybody, making sure that firstly trying to make sure that there were as few people in the room as possible, but also making sure that everybody felt comfortable with everybody that was in the room, and everybody that was in the room was turned away, and all of this. There was lots of thought that went into those scenes, because there needs to be. And actually, the difficulty really was just that we were making a first feature on a limited budget and with limited time, and so there's never enough time to kind of give the those kinds of scenes need more time and more sensitivity, and sometimes you're not allowed that because of the schedule. But yeah, I think that everybody's experience of those scenes and everybody's feelings around those scenes are different, and so it's not something that you can kind of talk about in a more sort of bird's eye view way. But I think we did everything we could to make sure that there was sensitivity around that.
It was really
It also
beautiful.
it did feel like any nudity or anything was kind of Georgia's vision was so clear, and the way that she communicated it, the nudity sort of came second. It was about getting the moment and the essence and the intimacy, and it was never about being naked or having a sex scene. It was always what that really meant, and I think focusing on that, sort of then everything else sort of fell to the wayside, because you knew exactly what you were trying to achieve, as opposed to thinking as, oh God, here's a scene where we're going to get naked and we're going to be thinking about that. So it was never about that. It was about what's important in the story here.
And I thought it translated so well to screen. A lot of the times when I'll look at works like with the female body, I feel like it's catered towards a certain audience, where I felt like this was very like intimate, and almost felt like, oh, this is how women see each other. And I thought it was just so beautifully shot, all of it. And jumping ship really quickly, the relationship between Jean and Viv it felt so grounded, and I mean that, and that it was a really hard relationship, and it wasn't like this very like, oh, here's this like magical beautiful friendship. I thought it played to truth really well, what it's like when there's a little bit of gaslighting, and there's dismissive conversations happening. And so how conscious was the decision to kind of build that relationship in kind of the dark way that it was?
I was just looking at relationships around me, and I found it to be quite common that there would be two women in a relationship, and one person was maybe had been out for a decade, and the other person was newly out, and one person wanted to wear their queerness on their sleeve, and one person was quite hesitant about that and didn't want their lives to be defined by that. And so that was always there from the beginning. Touching on the kind of more toxic side of their relationship, I guess Kerry and I spoke a lot about what it is that draws, because there's a sort of self-flagellation, I guess, from Jean's perspective, in terms of being in a relationship with someone like Viv, and how that makes her feel, because she can't really she can't and she won't, and she doesn't want to transform into someone that's more like Viv, but just being with her is a form of torture in some way, because it's showing her something that she kind of wants but can't have. And so there's that, but then there's also from Viv's side of things, there's why is Viv drawn to Jean, and there's, you know, a whole sort of psychology of why she would want to be in a relationship with Jean. And I guess, yeah, I don't no real particular, it was all just kind of things that I had experienced in my own life or had always seen around me as being quite common in queer relationships between two women. Yeah, so it wasn't really, it was just sort of something that came out, and I wanted to be able to show these, you know, dual and very kind of different experiences, queer experiences that are living kind of alongside each other like that, and hold them under a microscope and show that, you know, neither one is really in the wrong. It's just that, you know, that it's impossible for those two things to kind of coexist in the same space, and that's really difficult. And yeah, I guess I'm not really interested in like getting to the bottom of it, because the messiness of it is what interests me, and we continue to unravel the messiness of it when we were filming.
Beautifully said. You said that you pulled on the real experiences of lesbians who were PE teachers in the 80s, and I wanted to ask, during that kind of initial, I'm assuming initial research phase, was there anything that you learned about their experiences that surprised you and that stood with you as you were making this film?
I don't know about surprising. It's hard to remember what was surprising and what wasn't, but I do remember, I suppose it was surprising and memorable that when those women spoke about their experiences, their emotions were so close to the surface, whether it be talking about a particular experience of, say, running into a student in a bar 30 years ago. The first time we spoke to one of our PE teachers about that experience, she was so emotional, and there was so much guilt and shame and regret tied up in her description of how she had behaved in that moment. And then with another PE teacher that we spoke to a lot, she's who inspired the character of Viv, because we asked her, it was kind of basic. We were in a development meeting with the BBC or some of our financiers, and they kept saying, what's the emotional cost for this character? And we were scratching our heads, because we felt like we'd shown kind of what the emotional cost was. But we went to go and meet Sarah that morning, and we said to her, what do you feel was the emotional cost of this law coming in when it did? And she just burst into tears and said that it was her relationships, and that her relationships, she kept falling in love and thinking that she'd found the right person, and then the relationship would fall apart and she wouldn't understand why. And she was so tortured by that. And again, the fact that she is a very impressive woman who keeps her cards close to her chest in some ways. And so for her to have been so openly emotional about it at 9 o'clock in the morning in a cafe in Leeds felt very surprising, I guess. And so that was the impetus to make, I don't know if the character of Viv didn't exist or whether we just made her more of a character at that point, but it felt very important then to kind of bring that in after that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I thought you did such a beautiful job honoring their stories. It was truly, I mean, it felt less like I was watching a movie and more like I kind of took like a time portal and just watched someone's life unfold in front of me. And you both did a spectacular job, and it's been a joy talking to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Have a
Sarah.
great rest of your day.